Welcome all. We are thrilled to have you here for Primetime, a new vision for midlife with Margie Lachman. We're very grateful to have Margie with us, and we are so excited for this book to launch in just over a week. And we are looking forward to a great conversation about how we can have a new vision for this period of our lives. My name is Seth Green, and on a morning like this one, I'm especially grateful to say I'm the dean here at the Graham School at the University of Chicago. Welcome to our gloriously green campus
Mm.
this time of year. And welcome to the Graham School for those who are not familiar, though I see many friendly faces and names. We are the home of lifelong learning at the University of Chicago since the very founding of the university, because when Rockefeller and our founding president, William Rainey Harper, were envisioning this university, they wanted to extend its intellectual atmosphere well beyond the traditional student to individuals whose daily occupations made it impossible for them to participate in the traditional undergraduate experience. And ever since then, we have been blazing new paths for individuals to learn across all ages and stages of their life. Very relevant for a conversation about midlife. And I'll just mention that we will be continuing to have a series of wonderful events over the weeks ahead. Next week, we'll actually have a conversation that I think is very relevant for midlife. It's about mattering, the secret
Mm.
to a life of deep connection and purpose. And with Jennifer, we'll be talking about how to matter in midlife and beyond specifically. Later in the month, we'll also have an opportunity for individuals who are thinking about our graduate student at large program to meet with the director. And then we'll have an info session for what's called our Crafting Your Next Chapter program for those who are designing a chapter beyond their longstanding careers. But the reason that you are all here is to hear from our wonderful guests. So let me take down my screen, and I'm going to add Margie here to a spotlight. And let me just share a little bit about Margie's extraordinary background before we jump into conversation. Margie Lachman is the Minnie and Harold Bierman Professor of Psychology at Brandeis University, where she directs the Lifespan Lab. She earned her AV from Boston University and her MS and PhD from the Penn State University. She's a leading expert on adult development and aging and is one of a small group of scholars who study midlife from a lifespan developmental perspective. Her honors include research awards from the American Psychological Association and the Gerontological Society of America. She has authored numerous scholarly articles and co-edited key volumes, including Multiple Paths of Midlife Development, Handbook of Midlife Development, and the APA, Handbook of Adult Development and Aging. She was a member of the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation Research Network on Successful Midlife Development, which launched the landmark Midlife in the United States study. And now she is the author of what I
Mm.
know is going to be a wonderfully selling and coveted book, Primetime. And so, Margie, we're so grateful to have you here with us. And to get started, I would love to kind of start with your book, which draws on 30 years as a co-investigator for that MIDUS study that I just mentioned, one of the longest running studies of adult development ever conducted. Can you talk about what the research reveals about how people actually experience midlife and how it challenges the idea that we so often hear about a midlife crisis?
Yeah. Well, thank you, Seth. It's so great to be here with your group. I really appreciate it. So let me start by talking a little bit about the Midlife in the United States study, MIDUS, which has been going on for more than 30 years. When we first started, there really wasn't that much known about midlife. It was surprising to us. We knew a lot about early adulthood, later adulthood, but there was this big gap in the middle. And so we have learned quite a bit over the last 30 years. And one of the first things we decided to study was the midlife crisis, just because that was about the main thing people talked about with regard to midlife. And it's really unfortunate that this is a stereotype or a myth that people have that midlife is associated with this sort of normative idea that everyone goes through a crisis, which we found out is not true. And so we went beyond that. That's not really what we were interested in, but we felt we had to at least investigate it given how much interest there was in the midlife crisis. But what is true is that it is a period where people look back at what they've accomplished, what their goals were, and whether they've met them or not. And then we hope look forward as well, because there's essentially a lot of time left, your half your life left to do new things. And so what we find in midlife is unlike this stereotype of it's all downhill, you can't change, and your life is really over. That's what people associate with the midlife crisis. What we find is that there are a lot of peaks in functioning in terms of self-confidence, self-esteem, creativity. Many things are really improving into midlife and beyond.
Wonderful. Well, I think that is really interesting. And one of the most surprising findings that I found when I read the work is that your personality changes potentially
Yes.
during midlife. Can you talk about how it changes and what's driving
Mhm.
that?
Yeah. So, also, another kind of myth that exists out there is that you can't change in midlife. And even personality psychologists for many years did believe that personality was fixed in adolescence. They
Mm.
said personality, quote unquote, is set in plaster by the time you reach your adolescence. Well, we now know that that's not true. When we think about personality, what we're really talking about are your behaviors, your thoughts, and your feelings. And those can change, and they can change in many different ways. The people that study personality, including myself, focus primarily on five personality traits: conscientiousness, openness to experience, agreeableness, neuroticism, and why am I forgetting the last one? Extroversion. Basically, those are things that can change in midlife and beyond. And there are three different ways you can change personality. It actually changes naturally. What we find in longitudinal studies is that conscientiousness increases with age, and agreeableness increases with age. Neuroticism healthily decreases with age. The other ways you can change personality if you want, if you're not happy, you can go and get help with a therapist or a counselor. But I think the most interesting, and this is fairly recent work, is what we call volitional personality change. If you want to be more extroverted, well, there are things you can do to be more extroverted. If you want to be more conscientious, you can change behaviors and become more conscientious.
Well, so I want to dig into that on two levels, Margie. One is what is driving that? Like, what do we know about why people would be
Mhm.
changing in those directions? And is it linear? Is the other question I'm curious about. Meaning, is it that at some point in midlife these things start to change that you're more agreeable? Is it
Mhm.
throughout? So maybe you can talk just a little bit more detail about
Sure.
both what's driving and what that
Yeah.
change looks like in
Yeah.
the like
Yeah.
lifespan setting.
Right. Well, I think one of the foundations of lifespan research is that there's the possibility for growth throughout life.
Right.
And I think when people get to midlife, it really is a natural time for be thinking about where you are and where you really want to be. It's a period of reflection. And so I
Yeah.
think that's what's really driving a lot of the changes is that, here I am, I'm age 40 or I'm age 50, and am I happy with where I am, who I am, and do I want to make changes? And I think that's really the first step is some people just don't even question that they could make changes. They think they're just sort of stuck with who they are. So I think that's a lot of what's driving it is this motivation to be a better person, and I think a lot of it also comes from the important role that people play in midlife. People in midlife are really playing important roles in the lives, not only their own life, but also the lives of many other people. And I think people realize that there are things that they may want to change and to do in order to be able to help other people as well, and those who are younger and older in their lives.
So, can you talk a little bit about this sense of control? Because you write in the book that people often feel a greater sense of control, not less, in midlife. And I'm
Yeah.
curious where that change comes from as well, and how it even relates to taking that ownership and
Yeah.
reflection on some of these
Yeah.
other personality dimensions.
Yeah. So, yeah, the sense of control is something that I'm very interested in. I've studied it quite a bit, and there are really two aspects to it. One aspect is what we call a sense of mastery. To what extent you have the ability to accomplish the goals you set out that the goals that you set out to accomplish, and whether or not you have the abilities to reach your goals and desirable outcomes. At the same time, there's also beliefs in constraints, perceived constraints. And this is to what extent you feel there are obstacles that are interfering or with the kinds of things that you want to do. And everyone has both. So people have a sense of mastery in some areas and not in other areas. And people also recognize not everything is completely in your control. There are going to be obstacles, things that get in the way of what you want to do. And when we think about control, it's sort of the balance. Can you balance it so that your sense of mastery is able to overcome the constraints, and you realize you may have to change some of your goals, adjust things in order to be able to balance this mastery and constraints. Now, where does it come from? So the sense of mastery really comes from experience and knowledge. So as you are getting older, you accomplish many different things. You are faced with many different obstacles and constraints in your lives. And so as you accomplish your goals and are able to deal with the stresses and the constraints that you face, it feeds into your self-confidence and your abilities. And you realize that even though there are these obstacles that get in the way, you are able to go beyond that and to reach your goals.
Well, so speaking of obstacles or complexity, midlife is also a time that you describe in the book as peak responsibility, right?
Mm-hmm.
Caring for aging parents while still often raising or mentoring a younger generation,
Mm-hmm.
often while in the peak of a demanding career. So, can you talk about how people navigate that pressure? And I thought it was really interesting. You wrote about what separates those who thrive from those who struggle with this peak responsibility of midlife. I'm curious if,
Mm-hmm.
after you
Yeah.
talk a little bit about how people navigate the pressure, you can talk
Mm-hmm.
about what are the separation points between, thriving
Mm-hmm.
versus surviving this stage.
Yeah, yeah. So you're right that midlife is a period where there are many demands on the person because they are sort of in the middle. They're in the middle generation.
Right, the sandwich.
And yes, we talk about the sandwich generation, and some of the research suggests that there's about a quarter of adults in their 40s and 50s do have children that they are caring for who are under the age of 18 and older parents who they're also caring for. So that is one of the experiences that many middle-aged adults feel. But it's not necessarily just in your family. It's also at the workplace. People in midlife are in demand for their wisdom and their experience in helping other people. And so one of the things that we have looked at is the benefits of giving and receiving social support. And there are benefits for both. And so, on the one hand, there may be these demands that people have in their social networks, but it's important to also balance what you giving and receiving. And there's really interesting research that suggests that people who are able to balance the support that they give and also are able to ask for help or receive support are the ones who seem to be doing better. And there's even research that suggests not only is giving good for your health, it's also good for the recipients as well, but it's good for the giver as well, as long as there's some sort of balance. And the balance may not happen at every point in your life. There may be some points, and midlife is probably one where the balance may be tipped in terms of giving more than receiving. But over the life course, we look to see to what extent one can balance and perhaps receive more help later on, and kind of get payback for all the things that you've done for people earlier in your life.
Well, so in the book, you also argue that this is a really important time where the decisions you make in midlife have an outsized impact on
Mm-hmm.
later years, and
Yeah.
even more necessarily than even childhood decisions. So, can you talk a little bit about the most important areas, let's say physical, psychological, social, where the
Mm-hmm.
choices we're making in our 40s and 50s really set the trajectory for what comes next?
Yes, I think in the physical realm, it's the most compelling.
Yeah.
What we find is that the physical health in midlife seems to be even more important for later life health than your biological indicators later in life. So, and one of the reasons is because a lot of diseases that happen in later life, aging related diseases, have their early beginnings and they start in midlife.
And
Even
when you
things,
say more important than the biological indicators later in life, what does that mean? Is it more important than our genetics or
oh,
like the decisions they're making, or more important than what we do later in life in terms of our health decisions?
Yeah. So that's a good question. So genetics is a whole different thing I didn't really talk about. And so I'll just say something quickly about genetics is that depending on the study you read, genetics doesn't play as big a role as you would think in terms
Right.
of your health and lifespan. So
Yeah,
that
I've
gives
seen
a,
25%. Or I mean, I know it's not
yeah, I
exact,
mean,
but
now
I've seen that
there's
it's a majority what you do and a minority, they believe now,
exactly,
what's in
yeah.
you.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen some recent studies that say, well, it may be more like 50%, but regardless of what the actual number is, what
Right.
I think
You
is
have a lot of
important,
control.
yeah, exactly, that people, you have a lot of control, your lifestyle and your attitudes and things like that do make a really big difference. So when I meant about the biological, so there are,
Yeah.
the things that everyone knows are important, things like your, glucose level and your blood pressure and your cholesterol, as some examples. Those indicators in midlife seem to be more important than
Right.
what those measures are later in life. And it's not that they're not
Yeah.
important in later life, but you kind of set the baseline in midlife. And if you have bad indicators, high cholesterol and high blood pressure, midlife is a longer period of time where you have these poor biological functions. And so that's why it's really important in midlife for people to be focusing on their health because there are these long-term implications. Now, that
And just on
said,
health, before we go forward, I'm asking for a friend. What are the top two or three things that you recommend doing for health
yeah.
in midlife to try to set that trajectory up well?
Okay. So the things that people already know about, these are nothing new, but I'm going to add one thing new. So the main things are behavioral lifestyle factors like your diet, keeping your weight, not drinking much in terms of alcohol, not really low to moderate alcohol use, no smoking, and physical activity. I call it a panacea because being physically active is so important for so many things. And it's the one thing that I think in the literature we find is consistently related to so many different health outcomes. But the thing that I want to add is what I call a psychosocial prescription, because people can't do all these things necessarily. That not everybody's going to have the right diet or the right weight or exercise all the time in midlife. It's a very busy time. There's so much going on, and people can't do everything. So I first want to say, even if you haven't done everything well in midlife, it's never too late to start and to do it. So that's a hopeful message. But the other thing I wanted to mention is that I believe that your mindsets and attitudes, and we have found evidence for this in our studies, are so important because it gives you the motivation. So if you have what I mentioned earlier, a sense of control, purpose and meaning in life, if you have social support, we find those characteristics support engaging in more healthy behaviors. So I like to start with that is get the right mindset and attitude that will then inform and feed into these healthy behaviors.
Well, so the MIDUS study that we started with has now followed many of the same respondents for nearly 30 years. What has that long-term view revealed about how people across midlife, are really changing that a snapshot study, which has been most of what's happened
Mhm.
until this study, have really been able to show? So how does that long-term view
Mhm.
kind of give us a new way of looking at
Mhm.
the change that's happening over
Okay.
midlife?
Yeah. So it's really important to think about the study that we did in the terms of it's a longitudinal study and we followed the same people. So we followed people, say, going from 40 to 50 and 60, whereas many studies would perhaps compare a 40-year-old with a different 50 with a 50-year-old who's different and a 60-year-old at the same point in time. And the findings really are very different when you compare people who are different at different ages versus the same people aging over time. I'll give you one example from the cognitive domain. What I would say, based on the research we've done, is that midlife is really a cognitive sweet spot. And what I mean by that is there are certain things that are going downhill. We all know that memory problems start to surface in midlife, but let me say that they're not the kind of memory problems that you need to worry about. They're not indicators of dementia. It's just a common experience that the more you know, the harder it is to remember things, and certainly things that you haven't thought about. So memory declines, yes. Speed of processing is the main thing we have confirmed in our study, does start to go downhill in midlife. But we don't have to do everything with lightning speed. When we give these tests for cognition in the lab, we're really giving people a speed test essentially. And so we do see some problems in the sense that people are not as fast as they used to be. But that doesn't really have an impact on their everyday life, which is important. So just to clarify then, what I mean by the sweet spot is some things are going down, like I mentioned. On the other hand, more things are going up. So people have accumulated so much knowledge and experience and wisdom. And we find evidence, for example, in the domain of inventors. We looked at patents and people who had inventions, and it peaked in midlife. The number of inventions that people had was highest in midlife. And we think it's because of this nice juxtaposition of things are not all the way down. Things that are going down haven't reached their down point yet, their low point. Things that are on the way up are still going up, but they're pretty good at this point, your knowledge and confidence and experience. And so we think that juxtaposition, it's really this sweet spot for cognition, which we were
Well,
able
and
to find.
patents, I know the Kauffman Foundation just came out that, there are more businesses than ever being created by people in their 50s, and they're
Yeah.
3 times more likely than
Uh,
businesses created earlier in life. The really big breakthrough moments often do come from younger people with fluid thinking. So we
that's
associate
right.
it with, Mark
Yes.
Zuckerberg or,
Yeah.
the young Steve Jobs or
Yeah.
young Bill Gates. And that is true. Those transformative companies often are from people that they
True.
actually have fluid and they don't have as much pattern recognition and they do things that might be crazy to the world, but they end up
Yeah.
working.
Yeah.
But overall, many more successful businesses are created by people in midlife because they have, this mix still of some fluid intelligence, but a lot of
Yeah.
crystallized to be able to make good
Exactly.
investments and use
Yeah,
their networks and
right.
other
And I'll
things.
just say very briefly to confirm what you said in our research, we looked at the quality of the patents and we found this difference in terms of the kind of patents by younger people were things that we call had more forward citations, which is consistent with what you were saying about more breakthroughs. Whereas the ones who were older, their patents were more drawing on earlier inventions, we call backward citations. And so I really think that is very consistent with what you were just saying about the differences. They're both important and they're both creative, but they use different kinds of cognitive skills.
So bringing it together, we still think of this midlife moment as sometimes a low in at least the happiness curve. I'm sure you've
Mm,
seen some of those representations.
hmm
Given all of the positives of midlife, why are we still there? Is it the peak responsibility and complexity? Is it that even though we're changing, it's hard to change? I mean, I'm just curious how to kind of put
hmm
this kind
hmm
of set of data and evidence up against that happiness curve and understand where you think it goes from
hmm
having all this generativity, but also, at least from what I've seen, still being at a low point for many people in terms of, what could consider to be that joy component.
I think what underlies a lot of the negative associations is negative views of aging that our
Yeah.
society has. People get to 40 and 50, they start to see physical changes, these very superficial kinds of changes, hair thinning, hair graying, loss of hair,
Those
wrinkles.
are all me, by the way, Margie. So I appreciate your helping me to come to terms with those.
And wrinkles, and need reading glasses, and all of these things, I think really trigger this sort of nervous response like, I'm getting old, I'm aging. And I think that's really the heart of it. That's where it begins. People start to feel more aches and pains. They have an injury, it takes longer to heal. And so that does start to happen in midlife. And I think that underlies a lot of it. Now, you talk about the U shape. I could go on forever about the U shape. I mean, you can, and I do in the book. I talk a lot about it and how it's changed. But I really think that misrepresents life
Right.
satisfaction. In our longitudinal study, we find people actually peak life satisfaction in midlife, and many people maintain high life satisfaction into their later years. When we follow people over time, we don't really see a dip in midlife. That's not true for everyone. There are some people who do have depression in midlife or anxiety or difficulties. We can't talk about everybody being happy in midlife, but on average, people tend to maintain their level of satisfaction throughout midlife and beyond.
We have a question here from Faye Sahe. What are some differences in advice for people in their 50s versus 60s? And
Ah,
and maybe, to make that a little bit broader, because I know everyone's different, how
yeah,
do you think about midlife versus the adjacent kind of,
yeah.
later life?
Yeah. So the last chapter in my book is sort of beyond midlife. Now, what midlife is a whole nother question that we don't have time for. But I mean, people in their 60s, if many people in their 60s still think of themselves as middle aged. And my definition of midlife is very broad because subjective age, how old you feel, is more important than your chronological age.
Right.
It's related to your health and well-being and your functioning. And if you're still able to do the things you want to do and feel good, you don't feel old, you feel young. And people tend to feel about 20% younger than their age. So if you're 50, you're probably going to feel more like you're in your 40s. Or if you're in your 60s, you're going to maybe feel 10, 12 years younger than you are. So a lot of what what goes on in 60s has to do with where you are in terms of your life. Are you retired or are you still working? Do you have grandchildren? Do you not? So it's really hard to pinpoint. But I think what I would say is I don't necessarily think people would consider themselves old in their 60s. In fact, there's research that shows that people don't think of themselves as old until much later, and typically only when they feel ill or they have some sort of physical problem.
And in terms of how you see people continuing on the trends of midlife, you talked about how personality changes potentially in midlife as we begin
Hmm.
to reflect. Does that continue all the way through the rest of your life cycle? And does it stay as high? Are people making
Yeah,
as many personality changes
yeah,
in, for example, their 80s as
yeah.
in their 50s? Or is this really a moment of inflection and then it comes back down again?
Yeah. It usually stabilizes after 50s. So searching for different identities, and maybe changing some aspects of the personality typically don't happen past 50s. I mean, that's not true for everybody, but there's the research typically says that personality and identity tend to stabilize in the 50s. And so people are hopefully you're sort of happy and you're who you are, and comfortable in your own skin as you enter as you say exit midlife or become later in life. And I think that's fair to say.
Well, so you applied a lot of your evidence earlier in the context of how do you think about health and, really being intentional about investing in your health in your midlife so that you continue to have generativity later. I'm curious, as someone who studied this for decades, what are a couple of practices that you recommend more broadly than kind of the diet and exercise, but
Hmm.
cognitive, social, psychosocial,
Hmm.
those practices
Hmm.
that you think are really important for people to be embracing in midlife, to
Hmm.
be thriving in
Hmm.
midlife and beyond?
Hmm. I would have to say activity in general. So being
Yeah.
active. And I think of it in terms of cognitive activity or cognitive stimulation, social activity, social interactions, and then physical activity, physical interactions. Those three things. And what we find, for example, with cognitive stimulation is learning something new. Your group here is a good
Yeah.
example. They're all there learning something new. That is so beneficial for your brain, and your well-being. So learning something new, not just, doing the same old thing, but really learning something new creates new pathways in the brain, and it's really good for you. And then, of course, the social interactions are so important. It's really so highly related to your health and well-being. And then also, and volunteer work is one good way to do that. Say if you're retired and you've lost a lot of your social context from work, volunteer work is an amazing way to sort of uh, make up for that. And then, of course, the physical activity is the one thing, and it doesn't have to be running marathons or going to the gym. It's even walking is so useful and important, and it's good for all aspects of health. It affects your well-being, your psychological well-being, your cognitive abilities, as well as your physical health.
Well, you said earlier one of the biggest threats is false views about aging. And you have given us a new view of aging during this conversation. And I take away that the best thing to do is be part of a wonderful lifelong learning community where you're constantly engaged in new thought. You're doing so
Yeah.
in relationship with others, and you may even be getting out of bed to go in person to be part of your classes
Yeah,
where you're getting some exercise to boot. So thank you,
exactly.
Margie, so much for visiting with us. Thank you all for joining us. And I hope for all of us, we're able to embrace your vision of midlife and look forward to continuing the conversation next week with Jennifer on mattering. Thank you all again, and
Okay.
thanks especially to
Thank you
Margie.
so much. Good to be here. Thank you.